Hey everyone, welcome back. Good to see you. Here we are again, another episode of revisiting the road to serfdom. Right, Kevin of Engineering Politics, myself are going through this book chapter by chapter, trying to help people understand the importance and the significance and the relevance, increasing relevance of Hayek's seminal work that was written mostly as a warning against socialism. I would say is one of the best ways to sum it up. But last time we went over chapters 1 and 2. Kevin, you want to walk people through kind of what those chapters were about and what they missed? And we'll put links to all this stuff for you guys, but just to recap for the folks at home.
Yeah, sure. So right now we're going to be on chapter 3. So chapter 1 covered the introduction material. Chapter 2, or not chapter 2, episode 1 covered the introduction material. Episode 2 covered chapter 1 and 2. And so just to do a quick summary of chapter 1, chapter 1 was titled The Abandoned Road, and it was mainly about abandoning the road to liberalism, which was the road that was creating progress and prosperity. And it was kind of this, road developed over time that we're able to kind of learn from and see what created the best prosperous country or created the most individual freedom. This concept of individual freedom and individual liberty was relatively new. I mean, considering human history, it's extremely new, right? But we found that we're able to progress as a whole, as a collective, as acting as a part of a more liberal society. And now this is a part where I want to make sure that we get our definitions correct, because I know a lot of conservative people out there, a lot of people who are like, oh, those darn liberals. We are talking about the definition of liberalism in the 19th European sense. That is individual freedom. Yeah, 19th century sense, which is individual freedom from government coercion. So that is the actual definition of liberalism. And when we talk about liberalism in this context, the Hayekian context, that is what we're going to be talking about. It is not the American sense, which, Hayek calls out in the introduction saying, why are you liberals allowing these other people to hijack this word? But in the American sense, it is the exact opposite. It is government intervention into everything, or the advocation for that. So that is not what we're talking about when we talk about liberalism. We're talking about it in the European sense. And then we went on to chapter 2, which is titled The Great Utopia, which is the adoption of socialism and collectivism. So once we veered off that road, we now veered on a different path, that instead of the road to liberalism, we're going on the road to servitude. And then that is where he gets into words like planning, which I know you can explain.
Yeah. So just to piggyback on what you just said briefly, what I said in the first one and say it every single time is that whenever you hear liberal, when you hear Hayek say liberal, think of probably our modern context, just think conservative, libertarian type thing, honestly. That's going to give you the best understanding of what he's talking about. But planning, so planning is this word that was thrown around, which really just means a top-down direction of the first off resources, and then those resources being put towards like various ends and stuff. So the opposite of planning would be, or at least planning in this sense, and Hayek does a good job of saying, like, look, there's two different kinds of planning here. Every single person who wants to solve common problems is a planner. And so he says, but whenever we're talking about planning, we're talking about planning that is doesn't use competition, that doesn't use the free market. This is, you have someone at the top, or a group of, benevolent philosopher kings at the top who are making decisions of, this is what prices should be. This is where these resources should go. This is where these resources should go. And planning just everything about society, everything about economic transactions, everything about like how should our collective labor be allocated, and how should resources be allocated. So planning is in a sense, if you think about like a wartime economy, when there's rationing, when you think about like, no, this factory is going to make this, you're not going to make refrigerators anymore. You're going to make tanks because we need tanks and we said so. Now in a wartime context, sure, that makes sense. But this is like a peacetime context of basically the government's going to decide where resources go, who gets what, and what things cost. And it's not left up to the market. It's not left up to like the price mechanism and individual like transactions and mutually beneficial transactions. It's up to, people at the top to decide that.
Yeah, absolutely. So planning is not really a term that's thrown around as much now. So, and even Hayek has said this in one of his later introductions, that it's not a word you see often, but socialism is now a word that's becoming more and more popular. And that was a word that he said, and after World War II, that was a word that was completely off limits. We don't talk about that. That's just a naughty word. But he said it will be rebranded and reinstituted in some way in the future. And he could not have been more right there. With open socialists in the American government and open socialists in just about every Western government right now. So, this came true. And this is the reason why this book is so important now, is to say, hey, this is the road that we saw Germany go down. This is the road we saw Italy go down. And he wasn't even able to expand into Russia yet because he wrote it in 1944. But he inspired people like George Orwell to talk about things that kind of went along the road of capitalism or communism. So, we see what happens when you move that far down. So I don't know if we want to dive into it right now. Chapter 3.
Yeah. One of the things I would just add, and then, is he does say, you're talking about how we don't use planning and stuff anymore, but one of the things that does get used, and I think he mentions this in maybe one of the 76 or something, is that it's words like social justice or, bureaucracies and these kinds of things that are being used, or like new liberties, new freedoms. And so it's the same idea as just being rebranded. But yeah, so chapter 3 is called Individualism and Collectivism. And one of the things that, it's been funny, at least the last couple of times that Kevin and I have went through this, that we'll have the exact same quotes and the exact same things in mind that we think are important and want to go over. And one of the things we did last time was there was a huge section in the middle of one of those chapters, I think it was chapter 1 actually, that was like, this is worth unpacking, this is worth diving into. In the beginning of chapter 3, Individualism and Collectivism, again, there's a link to a PDF that at least goes through chapter 3. You guys can follow along if you want. But we're going to unpack this thing, because I would say, and Kevin, you can tell me if you agree or disagree, but I feel like this is probably one of the most prescient things, at least so far, that we've covered. And we're going to get into this time and time again, where you read this and you're like, okay, this could have been written in 1944, or it could have been written 2 weeks ago. And so this to me seems like one of those sections that it is incredibly relevant for mapping onto our current context and worth kind of dissecting, as such. I don't know if you would agree with that statement.
This is
I don't know if I'm overstating it.
No, this is the trade-off that you get when you read very profound people. Is they're great, but every page you have to stop and think for like a half an hour and be like, wow. Mm-hmm. Like, what did I just read? How is this applicable to now? And this is what happened here. I mean, I think I copied the first 3 paragraphs verbatim because of how great he dove into the subject matter and how relevant it is today. So he does this time and time again. And I know we'll probably say this during every single episode, be like, all right, we had to quote this big chunk because it was just so good. But it's a good problem to have.
So I'll read just through the first part here, and then we can kind of unpack it, and then we'll read through the next part. Does that sound okay?
Do we want to read the opening quote?
Yeah, I was gonna add that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So the chapter opens with this quote: "The socialists believe in 2 things which are absolutely different and perhaps even contradictory: freedom and organization." Eli Halevi. I don't know who that person is, but they are right in that quote. So here's the section. "Before we can progress with our main problem, an obstacle has yet to be surmounted. A confusion largely responsible for the way in which we are drifting into things which nobody wants must be cleared up. This confusion concerns nothing less than the concept of socialism itself. It may mean it being socialism, and is often used to describe merely the ideals of social justice, greater equality, and security, which are the ultimate aims of socialism." I'm going to read that again. So he's saying socialism may mean, and is being used to describe by a lot of these people, merely the ideals of social justice, greater equality, and security, which are the ultimate aims of socialism. But it means also the particular method by which most socialists hope to attain these ends, and which many competent people regard as the only methods by which they can be fully and quickly attained. In this sense, socialism means the abolition of private enterprise, of private ownership, and the means of production, and the creation of a system of planned economy in which the entrepreneur working for profit is replaced by a central planning body. There are many people who call themselves socialists, although they care only about the first, who fervently believe in those ultimate aims of socialism, like social justice, but neither care nor understand how they can be achieved, and who are merely certain that they must be achieved, whatever the cost. But to nearly all those whom socialism is not merely a hope, but an object of practical policies, the characteristic methods of modern socialism are as essential as the ends themselves. Many people, on the other hand, who value the ultimate ends of socialism, no less than the socialists, refuse to support socialism because of the dangers to other values they see in the methods proposed by socialists. This dispute about socialism has thus become largely a dispute about means, not about ends. Although the question whether the different ends of socialism can simultaneously be achieved is also involved. So let's stop there. There's a lot to unpack there that seems super prescient. And it's just like, this is the same argument that we've been having, that we've been having maybe even since Bernie Sanders, in terms of at least broke out in the surface, in the 2016 presidential campaign. It seems like the same argument.
Yeah. There's this really, really good quote that I think of here that I cannot remember who said it and it verbatim, but it's about vice and virtue, where vice is not the absence of virtue. It is just choosing one virtue above all the other ones. And this is what I think about when it comes to here. It's not that you're attempting to do something evil by implementing planning. You're not attempting to say, I want to hurt people. You are saying that we need to fix this one problem, whether it be some form of social justice or some other form of, war on poverty or something else. We must achieve this at whatever the cost. So what are you trading off by achieving that? And we get in more to this in the next chapter when it comes to specialists and these experts that we talk about.
Yep.
But it is the single-minded person who's focused on this one thing and they don't care about the costs of it. So I think, that's exactly what I think of when it comes to trying to use central planning to achieve a certain goal, because this goal has to be forced on the people. You have to get rid of the individual freedom, the individual liberty aspect in order to gain what you want for the collective. But the tricky little part is here, the collective is always going to be controlled by a central entity. So it's not really collective at all. It just claims to be. It forces these ideals onto the people rather than allowing them to choose their own ideals.
Yeah, exactly. And like you just said, it's being forced on people, hence the quote at the beginning. Socialists believe in two things that are probably contradictory, which is freedom and organization. You can substitute organization for planning there. And, whenever I say this is the argument that we've been having, to kind of sum up what Hayek was saying there, I know that was kind of a longer quote, but for people who are, listening or watching, he's saying, look, there are people who are saying socialism, and what they're not talking about a political system. They're not talking about a means of accomplishing something. They're just talking about what they want to happen. So in their minds, socialism is synonymous with social justice. Socialism is synonymous with equality. Socialism is synonymous with security. And so he's saying people are using this word to describe the things that they want to happen. And he's like, look, and this is where I'm like, this is the same argument where you hear these conservatives saying, we probably want the same things. We just disagree on how to get there and what's the best way to achieve these things. And so Hayek is saying, like, there are people who wholeheartedly agree with these ends that these advocates of socialism want, but they outright reject socialism. And I like how he says they refuse to support it because of the dangers to other values they see in the methods proposed by the socialists. And so, but what you see on this is primarily a left-wing phenomenon, is that, look, it's like, you don't agree with this policy, so therefore you're anti-woman or you're anti-black or something like that. You don't care about people. You don't care about kids. You don't care about these things. You don't care about the same values. And so that's where you get this like moralizing and moral posturing and bullying, where it's like, it's a complete straw man and defamation of character, where it's saying, okay, just because I don't agree with that this is the best way to do something, or even an intelligent or moral way to do something, like to say that I don't care about the ends is ridiculous, because I'm not saying we shouldn't want this. I'm saying that your way of getting it done is a bad way of getting it done. And so it's the same freaking argument that we have over and over and over again. Oh, you don't support the welfare, programs. You don't support these things and that thing. Oh, you don't care about poor people. You don't care about the inner city. You don't care about that. And it's like that rhyming. It's this freaking rhyming over and over and over again, where they use this moralizing language to bully people, to like make it seem like they're the bad guy. And what it does ultimately, so Hayek is saying this is about means, not about ends. And we have to have a conversation about means. But the people who are doing this, who are conflating these two things, are taking the conversation completely in a different direction than anything about ends or means. And it's all about like who you are as a person. You're a bad person. You don't care. You're immoral. You're an oppressive person. You're calloused and uncaring because you don't agree with my ends. And so now the conversation shifts to what are your how do you feel on the inside as a person? How compassionate are you? Instead of having some fact-based conversation about what's the best way to do this thing. Why are we talking about how much I care or don't care about people according to your assertion, instead of, hey, maybe school choice is a good idea and here's the arguments about it. You know what I mean? And so it just blows my mind how this is just a rehash of these same arguments that are dominating. It's the same people moralizing and grandstanding on these things. And in the meantime, the problems only get worse.
Yeah. I mean, the perfect example of this, which is something we align on and not necessarily you, the listener, might agree with, but it's, abortion. Like, we want to make sure that women have more autonomy, that they're able to enter the workforce and have the same rights as men. But the means to get there means you can abort a child. Like, you and I were like, we don't agree with those means. I don't. That
doesn't make any sense.
That's not a trade-off that we think is worth having. We actually find it to be extraordinarily immoral. So, that's an example of like those means are evil, even if the ends are justified. And I want those ends too. I don't want a woman to not have the same opportunities that I do just because, something happened to her or she made a bad decision. Right. So to get into that next paragraph, which I don't think this would be enough to create confusion. You didn't read that paragraph yet, right?
I didn't. Can I just add one thing really fast that I think is worth adding there, is that I think it's fair to say that most of the people making these arguments don't realize they're having a different conversation. Most of the people who are, and I know I'm thinking of people, whether it's my past self before I, actually knew things, or people that I know, that most of the people who are having this argument about like, I can't believe you don't care about that, I can't believe that, don't realize that they're having a conversation that's different than the conversation we're having. We're having a conversation about like, I agree with you, what's the best way to do this? And they hear, you don't agree with how I want to do it, therefore you don't care about the ends. And I think this is a testament to the propagandizing and the really, really effective, really in a lot of ways brainwashing of these well-intentioned people, the very smart people, as James Lindsay would call them, useful idiots from the Soviet Union. This is a testament to the success of that, is that I think most of the people who make these arguments are largely making it in good faith, although maybe there's a willful ignorance involved there, and that it's not necessarily them intentionally trying to demagogue the issue, if that makes sense, just to try and be charitable to a lot of these people.
Absolutely. So to continue on the quote, this would be enough to create confusion, and the confusion has been further increased by the common practice of denying that those who repudiate the means value the ends. It's exactly what we just talked about here, is saying that if you do not agree with the means, even though we have the same ends, you are an evil person. That this is the switch they have there, but it doesn't end there. So, but this is not all. The situation is still more complicated by the fact that the means, the economic planning, which is the prime instrument of socialist reform, can be used for many other purposes. We must essentially direct economic activity if we want to make the distribution of income conform to the current ideas of social justice. Planning, therefore, is wanted by all those who demand that production for use be substituted for production for profit. So production for use, that Hayek, I think, brought up a bit in the introduction, is a really, really common phrase that they used in the 1940s to switch out for production for profit. I don't really know. I haven't really heard many people talk about production for use, although through the back end, Bernie Sanders, AOC, you've certainly heard those people saying, look at these evil people who just want profit. we should demand that they use it for people who just need it and they don't worry about the profit. Like, take
climate alarmist, climate justice.
Well, the big one to me is healthcare. Healthcare is a huge one. It's like, why do you evil corporations want to make money? Well, they want to make money because they can turn around a vaccine in 9 months when it normally takes a year and a half at best. That is what the profit motive does for you. So, they're trying to eliminate that and substitute in this phrase that they used to use a lot called production for use. So continue quote, but such planning is no less indispensable if the distribution of incomes is to be regulated in a way in which to us appears to be the opposite of just. Whether we should wish that more of the good things of this world should go to some racial elite, the Nordic men, or the members of a party or an aristocracy, the methods which we shall have to employ are the same as those which could ensure the equalitarian distribution. So, good correction. So yeah, right there is this planning can be used for a lot of things that the planners are going to claim are just, but you can use it for some awful purpose. Think Germany in the 1940s. They used this for some evil, awful purposes that were used for a racial elite, creating more living space for the people who they deemed are properly fit to have kids, and expand the gene pool, and to eliminate those who weren't. So these planning authorities, because it's a centralized power and because it's not only used for the purpose that they say they want to use it for, but they can now expand this power to use it for now purposes as long as they're in. Again, Hitler was democratically elected. He was able to get in and claim that I want to make your life better. And then while he got that power, he's like, all right, I'm making all these other changes that, might make your life better depending on, how you're born or what you believe. So, to really caution yourself when you have anyone coming to you saying like, just give me a little bit more power and I can do all these things for you. That's going to make your life better.
Yep. Can I read the next quote here? Because I think and then we can synthesize like those two things, because I think the next quote is like exactly like what we're talking about. Yet, although to most socialists, only one species of collectivism will represent true socialism, it must always be remembered that socialism is a species of collectivism, and that therefore everything which is true of collectivism as such must also apply to socialism. It must also not be forgotten that socialism is not only by far the most important species of collectivism or planning, but that it is socialism, it is socialism which has persuaded liberal-minded people to submit once more to that regimentation of economic life, which they had overthrown because, in the words of Adam Smith, it puts government in a position where, to support themselves, they're obligated to be oppressive and tyrannical, end quote. So yeah, I think that's worth mentioning there, because it's like what you were saying, and that's an extension of that other part where he's like, look, you want these goals, you want social justice, you want all of these other things, but what you need to understand is that this is like this central planning and the socialism. This is collectivism. So you're wanting to use collectivism to achieve these means. And you need to look and see where are the other places where this ideology has been implemented to its logical conclusion, as like Ayn Rand would say, and what did it lead to? And he's like, look, the same means, which is planning here, that are used to create putting all of the good things to some racial elite, which would be the Nordic men, and with Nazism, or the members of a party or an aristocracy. Those are the same way that those things come to pass, which we would all agree are evil, are the same things you're wanting to use to ensure, equalitarian distribution. And it's like it's the one ring. It's what was his name, Boromir in the first one. Wasn't Boromir in the first Lord of the Rings movie, where he's like, we can use it. We can use the ring for good, and it can't be done. He's saying like, whenever you centralize all these things, and I know we'll get into this in later chapters, where it's like, this leads to that's the thing over and over and over again. That's how he starts the chapter, right? We're drifting into things no one wants. No one wants. Real socialists, if they saw where this goes, would be appalled at the consequences of their ideas. And so Hayek is saying, look, like this is a disagreement about means, not about ends. The means that we want to use, us liberals in the true sense, we want to stay on the road that has brought us here in the first place. It's a slow process, but it's a process we know that leads to this. And there's this other, the road you're wanting to get on is a form of collectivism. It's the most important form of collectivism. And it's the same way in which, whether it's a racial elite or an aristocracy or a party or whatever, gains absolute power and control over a society and tyrannizes the hell out of its population afterwards. And it is wildly naive and irrational even to assume that you can go down that road and you'll be the exception, right? Like true tyranny has never been tried. Like true benevolent tyranny has never been tried, you know, basically. And it's just a ridiculous idea.
Yeah. I mean, I like what you said before that, you know, they implement the same strategy that they're fighting against. So to me, like, you know, they try to get rid of the racial elite by creating a racial elite, and we'll get into later. They try to eliminate monopoly by creating a government-run monopoly. But you know, I think of you know the anti-racism CRT stuff that's happening lately. Racism, you know, uses racial discrimination. Non-racism tries to eliminate discrimination. Tries to say we don't care about this discrimination. It'll naturally go away when people know they can freely exchange with other people. Anti-racism brings back the racist idea of racial discrimination. It is using fire to fight fire, I guess, in that way, rather than water to fight fire, like a normal person would. So it is flipping this, and this is that. I mean, I bring up CRT because that's a part of social justice, which is explicitly what we're talking about here. You know, Hayek understood that, you know, what Marx started with trying to make everyone care about all these economic issues has now moved to kind of post-Marxism, where it has expanded to social issues, where you get social justice and all these other you know, projects that these people want to work on and hammer down and create this new brand of equality, which is now equity, and control everyone's life via a central power, via that coercion.
Yeah, I mean, that's the Kendi quote, right? The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination.
Yeah.
And so it's saying we need to use discrimination to get rid of discrimination, which of course is insane, insanely illogical.
And like we mentioned in the last episode, the thing is, these people, like they put this out there. They're not hiding the ball, you know, especially the people at the thought leaders in this is like, they don't hide the ball. And, you know, believe in what they say. Don't try to take what they say and be like, well, what they probably meant was, you know, a nicer version of whatever they're saying. Like, no, just believe in them. Trust them.
Yep. So I don't think we need to read all of this next quote to extract some ideas from it. But one of the things that we've mentioned before in previous episodes is that Hayek was actually charitable to his opponents' arguments almost to a fault. He was incredibly charitable to them. And he actually got criticism for that, you know, being too charitable to some of these ideas. But he does a good job in the rest of this chapter because he's like, look, this is a disagreement about means, not about ends. And so, like, we want to talk about, like, what are your arguments? What are your concerns? What are the things that you're trying to do, that you're trying to accomplish? And what are the arguments you might have against us? And Hayek spends a good amount of time saying, I'm not arguing against government intervention per se. I'm not arguing against the existence of government. In fact, there are places in which you have to have this. And he quotes Adam Smith that, you know, at one point, I think it was Adam Smith who says, there's no situation in which a government would do nothing, or which a reasonable person would think that the government would do, or would just sit and do nothing. And so, like, we can get into that of where he's saying, and you just bolded that. So why don't you read that and kind of, you know, piggyback on what you think is the most important part of this?
Yeah. So like you said, he's not against all forms of government intervention or regulation, but what he does want to parse out is really the argument against what he calls here the liberal plan, which is allowing individual freedom and the price system to plan out the economy. And so he goes here, this liberal plan, which I said, according to them, is no plan, and it is indeed not a plan designed to satisfy particular views about who should have what, right? So they're concerned that these individuals, like, how can they get together and figure out what's best for society? We ought to do that. You know, a central authority ought to do that. To continue the quote, what our planners demand is a central direction of all economic activity according to a single plan, laying down how the resources of society should be consciously directed to serve particular ends in a definite way. That's what they want.
Yep.
The modern planner wants to say, you know what, this individual liberty stuff, you know, it's great and all this other stuff, but the plan that I want to accomplish has to be directed by a central authority. And
Yep.
that's important.
And
we can't rely on all these people to do what they want.
exactly. And one of the things later in the quote, which I think is important, is he says, the question is whether for this purpose it is better for the holder of coercive power should confine themselves in general to creating conditions under which the knowledge and initiative of individuals are given the best scope so that they can plan most successfully, or whether rational utilization of our resources requires central direction and organization of all our activities according to some consciously constructed blueprint. So what he's saying there is, when he says holder of coercive power, that's government. Government has a monopoly on violence, right? That's the quote. And so he's saying there are these people who say, well, the government has a monopoly on violence. They have coercive power. And for them to not use coercive power to bring about the things that I think are most valuable, which again, we'll get into the experts and their very narrow and limited understanding of society here in a little bit. But he's saying they think that for the government to not get involved in these things constitutes no plan. And it goes back to what Hayek said in The Abandoned Road in chapter 1, where he says, look, the role of a liberal is like someone who has a garden. Like, you can't make the plant grow. All you can do is try to make sure that the environment and the setting is conducive for growth. But at some point, it's not up to you. You're there to try and make sure that the atmosphere is conducive for growth. And there are these people who say that's not a plan at all. You have coercive power. You need to use it and throw your weight around and throw your monopoly on violence around to accomplish all these things that I think are best. And you have to do it this way, or else you don't care. Like I said, it's about, should it be consciously directed to serve particular ends of a definite way. And so again, it goes back to, this is a conversation about means, not ends. And here he's saying there is people who say this should be top down by some benevolent, leaders who I guess are incorruptible in any way, but with absolute power. Or do you let this thing of, because what was the quote from, was it the 80s? Maybe earlier, I could be wrong, but it's like, is the economy stupid, or is the market stupid? And it's like, no, just because there is no one directing this thing doesn't mean that it doesn't make sense and it has a sense of harmony to it. Like, there's no one in the ocean directing schools of fish to go this way or coordinate in these, manners. But the ocean is a very logically constructed ecosystem with, different fish doing different things. There's coral reefs, there's a deep sea, all these other things. And it makes perfect sense. There is no, Aquaman, King of Atlantis down there making sure that these fish go and do this. That's true. That's true.
We've explored most of the ocean, man. I'm just saying.
It feels like a very
Jason Momoa might be down there.
That's right. It's like the evidence is inconclusive to the existence of Aquaman. But anyway, but the point is that these people see like people conducting mutually beneficial transactions without anyone, telling them how to do it and what they should value, as having no plan at all, which is crazy. And so they see, well, you have coercive power, you need to use it to accomplish my goals. And this goes back to collectivism. This is what collectivism is a top-down collective grouping everyone together and all the resources to follow some centralized plan and some centralized allocation of resources and values, which they don't think this is a hierarchy. When you prioritize this, then you're demoting all of these other things, and there are costs to these things. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So, and so he, we kind of mentioned at the beginning that he's not completely against government regulation, government intervention. And I like his response to it. So I kind of paraphrase a little bit here, and then I have a quote coming in later, but I guess you can get into the paraphrase. What I wrote here is Hayek believes in free market economics, but understands that the proper response to socialist or collectivist proposals is not dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes. So the dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes is something that he puts in there. And that's something I think of when you think of like Ayn Rand. Like, I'm a conservative. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this are pretty big fans of Ayn Rand, but I think she's got some significant flaws in her ideology. And I think the dogmatism of laissez-faire economics is one of those things, to say there's no room for any sort of government involvement at all, which I think that's certainly flawed. We're not going to get into here, but so I continue to say regulation via the government does have an important place in society. And then here's Hayek's thoughts on the main advantages of what he calls economic liberalism. So I'm going to quote from the book here. Economic liberalism regards competition as superior not only because it is in most circumstances the most efficient method known, but even more because it is the only method by which our activities can be adjusted to each other without coercive or arbitrary intervention of authority. So this is the part that he gets into the competition, this what he calls the price system, which is a form of competition, is the best way to do things efficiently, but also the best way to adjust these activities to each other. When you have a central power, they don't normally worry about adjusting activities to much of anything except for their political goals, right?
Yep.
So they'll adjust just freely on there. But how often are those political goals going to line up with even a majority of people who voted that central authority in? It doesn't often do that. So the idea, this is the reason we want to maintain the free market and free enterprise, is because we're able to adjust our activities to each other via currency exchange and just free trade.
Yep. I mean, that's what Hayek calls the fatal conceit of socialism, which is that, and again, going back to that quote at the beginning of the chapter, it's that organization and freedom can coexist. And this idea that, what he calls that fatal conceit is like, okay, the bigger the plan, and the more centralized it is, then the more you have to limit those who disagree with the plan. You have to curtail them. You have to curtail their freedom. So you have to either silence them, you have to use coercion on them, or, you have to ignore them. But either way, whenever you are, again, this is a competition of ideals. And he gives an example, I think, in the next chapter of like cars and some other things of maybe you could do this, but all of these hypotheticals are so unworkable and so impractical that it's they're not even worth entertaining. And by no means even constitute the only way in which these things would happen. And so, but the point is that as you have this centralized plan, what do you do what if only 65% of the people want it? What do you do with the other 35%? And how limited are they? How much are you going to have to remove their freedom or their ability to do these things or participate in society in order to make sure this plan can be implemented? I mean, this goes back to the classic that we're not a democracy on purpose, at least in the United States. We're a constitutional republic because true democracy is mob rule. I mean, it is tyranny of a majority on a minority, full stop.
A nation of
and it
laws,
will always
not of
only
people.
be that. Exactly. And so you have to understand that. And whenever and that's why it's important to make sure that people have as much freedom to do the things that they want to do. And so the government's job is to maintain the ecosystem, not to tell them what they should and shouldn't care about. Because whenever you do that, it comes at a cost to someone who might have an entirely opposite perspective, which is something he gets into later. And one of the things I do kind of want to briefly touch on is I think this idea where he mentions that, laissez-faire, dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes towards the market. One of the things that I find myself at constant tension with is I've been reading and listening to a lot of this stuff about anarchism and these super libertarian guys like Mises and Rothbard and so on, that it's and I was listening to Michael Malice explain, I was telling you before we started recording, explain anarchism to this guy who was trying to understand it. Some Bitcoin guy. The way this guy was talking about Bitcoin made Bitcoin sound like a religion to some of these Bitcoiners, as he put it. I'm like, what the? Anyway. And so, but anyway, Malice had this idea of, because, Michael Malice is someone who, by the way, I respect a lot. I think The New Right's a fantastic book. I want to read his book on North Korea, Dear Reader. So I like the guy, and he's a person who I find myself agreeing with a lot of his presuppositions about the nature of things. But whereas I don't see his solutions as being workable, and maybe there are no solutions to some of these things, but where Malice would say something like, okay, because he's someone who thinks there should be no government, right? So this is something that Hayek is arguing against when he brings up dogmatic laissez-faire. And, you know, Malice would say, well, the idea that we need government, you know, so that we can have some kind of rules and regulations. He's like, well, what if you go into Macy's and you might have to have a car or some other like upscale department store? He calls it velvet rope. He's like, I'm a very big velvet rope proponent where, you know, places should be able to restrict who does and doesn't come in. And he's like, you might have to have a car to get in. Here's the section for this. If you want to do returns, you can't do it here. You have to do it over here. Here's the dressing rooms. You know, you go to this dressing room, you go to that dressing room. He's like, so there are rules that we all obey and agree to, and no one would say Macy's is a government. And the other example he uses, like eBay has a fantastic returns policy in case people get screwed and all these other things. And so these are private companies that do this, and we would not call either of these things government, and they don't require coercion to do that. And the main, you know, issue I have with that is these are all examples of things that exist within a society that has a robust legal framework, which is one of the things Hayek mentions later in the chapter. Is like, you have to have some form of government, some form of legal framework to address the areas where prices aren't doing it, aren't sufficient. You know, when it comes to like the environment stuff, we'll get into that. But the idea that like you can imagine a world without government or without any type of rules whatsoever, based on institutions that exist within a world that does have laws and governments, to use us as examples is ridiculous to me. It's like, you have to look at what did it look like in the places where there actually weren't governments, and it was this utopian thing where people were just, you know, dogmatic laissez-faire, as he puts it. You know, the example I think of is the Wild West. Whenever there was
Mad Max.
Mad Max. Well, I mean, Mad Max doesn't exist, but it was kind of like Mad Max.
Right,
But my point is
but
like,
that's
look
the
at the
example
places
they always use. This is what's going to happen
Right.
if we eliminate this thing.
Yeah, and it's like, well, no, maybe not Mad Max, but it's might be like, you know, New Mexico or Arizona or, you know, Colorado before they were states, you know, before, whenever it was just people out there in the frontier. And that's why the term Wild West has a connotation that's like both negative and positive. The Wild West is like, it's the Wild West, man. Like, people are doing whatever they want, but there's other times where people was like, we don't want this to be like the Wild West. Like, you have to have some type of thing to make sure things don't get out of hand.
I've seen that movie. No, thanks. I don't want to have it turn into a Will Smith picture. Yeah.
The giant metal spider.
Yeah.
Save Selma Hayek from the big metal spider. The old school South Park reference.
Yeah.
But anyway, but just to address that, like, Hayek is saying, like, there has to be, and mostly I'm just kind of pontificating on what's my own internal things that I'm thinking about and trying to sort through right now. But that there does have to be some form of government here, and Hayek is advocating for that. So it's like, we probably agree on a lot of the same things. It's just there's some very specific things, like how much government with how much power to what ends. That distinction is not just important, it's the distinction. It's the distinction here.
Yeah. So I'm going to just continue on kind of the flip side. So a lot of the stuff you just mentioned now, I'm just going to quote from the book. So Hayek believes that there are some areas and examples in which a free market will function ineffectively. For example, quoting from the book here, is impractical to make the enjoyment of certain services dependent on the payment of a price. Competition will not produce services, think roads, road signs, and bridges, and the price system becomes similarly ineffective when the damage caused to others by certain uses of property cannot be effectively charged to the owner of that property. Think pollution, deforestation, and unethical farming techniques. So there are definitely some arenas there that
same arguments as today. Same things.
Exactly. But then he goes on to quote where we need to caution by going too far. So quote again, in such instances, we find some substitute for the regulation by the price mechanism, but the fact that we have to resort to the substitution of direct regulation by authority where the conditions for the proper working of competition cannot be created does not prove that we should suppress competition where it may be made to function. We do not, just because it works in this one place, just because we can coherently work to build an interstate does not mean we should be building every single, building in the entire country via a central planning board, right? We need to say that, okay, it works here, but what if competition can fill in this gap? Because it can do it more effectively. We know that. It can do it according to what people actually want, their needs. We know that. And this kind of is going to start to go into the next chapter. What happens when you say, you know what, I don't, a central planning board or the government just says, you know what, no, we're just going to have the government take care of this. This individual liberty aspect goes so far until, we find this one industry and then we want to take it over via central planning.
Yep. And I've seen, I think in the last week and a half, 2 weeks, articles from mainstream, corporate press. I like the distinction that Malice says. He's like, I don't want to call them mainstream media because a lot of the ideas they're putting out there are not mainstream ideas. Most people actually disagree with a lot of this. And so the corporate press, where it's like, is housing infrastructure? So they're talking about like Biden administration wants to do this big infrastructure bloated thing. I'm just going to get pissed if I go too much into it. But the point is that like, you're like that just because we can build a road, it doesn't mean that they should build every single building. And so they're like, as housing infrastructure. And I think I also saw is childcare or pre-K childcare infrastructure, or something like we've seen these arguments like, is this infrastructure? It's like, no, a bridge is infrastructure. A road is infrastructure. A babysitter is not infrastructure, you lunatic. And so, but these are the arguments that people make where it's like, there's no logical endpoint to a lot of these arguments. In that same interview where, this might've been one that I posted where Malice talked to Jordan Peterson. He mentioned that like the WWJD, What Would Jesus Do thing was created by a Christian socialist. And the idea is that it's like, it's not about saving the soul of an individual, but it's about saving the soul of a country. And if it's about like the morality and the soul of a country, there is no logical endpoint to the scope of which government has in that thing, because it's like, it's the whole thing. There is no logical distinction between where the individual begins and the government ends, and vice versa. And so whenever there's these people like arguing for how all of this is infrastructure, how all of this is this, and this central planning thing, there's no, and by the way, it's that way on purpose, that there is no logical distinction between the individual and the government. And, where the government, what's that old, the saying, I think I mentioned it before in the last episode, is like, your right to swing your fist ends where my face begins. It's like the government's right to swing its fist also ends where our face begins. But under this ideology, there is that line isn't there, because the rights and the desires of the government, i.e. this bureaucratic elite, supersedes any rights and desires of an individual.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to end this chapter, we have another quote here. I don't really think we need to get into this. I think we've kind of beat this one to the ground, but effectively, I mean, to read one of, or at least the beginning of the quote that I do think is important is the quote, "It is of the utmost importance to the argument of this book for the reader to keep in mind that the planning against which all our criticisms is directed is solely planning against competition, the planning which is to be substituted for competition." That is the planning we want to avoid. That is, something that if competition can work in that arena, it will always be more effective. And even if it's not always as effective as we want it to be, it doesn't advance as fast as we want it to be. It is much better than the alternative, which is government coercion.
Yep. No, I think that's exactly right. So to kind of sum up this chapter 3, Hayek is making the point that, one, socialism is a version of collectivism. And as such, what collectivism does, every criticism of collectivism and every virtue, as such of collectivism applies to socialism. And, what he talks about at the beginning is the main argument people are having here. There's all these people who use socialism just as a stand-in or as shorthand for social justice or these things that they want, and don't think about it as a thing that actually does things, that requires certain policies and things to be put into place first. They just think, it's underpants gnomes. Again, it's like socialism ? Justice, socialism ? Equality. And so they just see it as equality, or as justice or social justice. And so his point here is like, there are all these people, myself included, yourself included, Hayek included, who actually agree that we should have a society that is just, a society that is fair, according to using definitions that are logical, not the definitions we hear today. And so, don't say that because we disagree with your means of getting there, i.e. socialism, that we don't care about the ends. That's completely ridiculous. And that was what was happening then. And that's what we're seeing today. This has been the same. It's just, blowing up this kind of moral grandstanding. and demagoguing these issues. And he goes on to steelman, what some of those criticisms might be, what are the valid criticisms and where they might fall apart. And he does try to find common ground by saying, look, I'm not arguing for no government. I'm not arguing for no planning. That doesn't make sense. I'm arguing that there can't be a top-down total total planning, like you said at the end, against competition. We have to plan for competition, around competition, but we can't, have this top-down thing and assume it's going to lead to social justice or whatever, because it's actually probably going to lead to tyranny and destruction of rights. I don't know if you'd add anything else to that. I don't feel like that was a very good summary, to be honest. But
no, I mean, it's hard to summarize even one chapter of this book in a way that seems sufficient to cover all these profound things he said. But I do think that this is one of those chapters that a lot of his critics didn't seem to read, if they read it at all. And that's what he brings up a lot in the introduction, especially in the American version, where, the pushback against it in America was just as strong as the people who advocated for it. Because again, the big difference here between the European release, which was in 1944, they went through socialism. They understand what it is. They actually had it in practice. And then it came out into American paperback version in 1956, where America did not have this in practice. They did not have the experience of collectivism, at least not at the scale. Certainly had, the New Deal and all those collectivist policies, but they didn't have it in the same way that Europe had it. So the reaction to this book was either really, really high, where a lot of people that he said, like, I don't agree with the people who are praising me because they're using this version of dogmatic laissez-faire attitudes to praise this book and saying that I agree with all these things and government should stay out of everything. That's not what I'm saying. And then on the opposite side, where they say, if government wants to build a sidewalk, that's socialism. That's not what he's saying either. And both those are unfair. And this is a perfect chapter to really understand. And I like what you say there. He, as opposed to straw manning, which so many books do, their opposition, he does quite literally steel man their position to make sure that he's being as generous to them as possible, which makes it even a better book because it helps you understand this balance of both sides a bit more. And this makes it more relatable now.
Totally.